Firstly, I'd like to echo Christopher and Tiziana's thanks to the organisers of this fascinating event. It's been a real pleasure to hear about the new discoveries in particular. What I'm going to talk about is, to some extent, picking up the same idea that we've already seen explored about the idea of Paestum. Sorry, I'm going to stick with the later name, seeing as I'm mainly discussing the Lucanian city, as a polis which defies categorization, one which has many different cultural layers to it and lots of very dense cultural interactions within it, obviously at all periods, as we've seen, going right back to the beginning of the city's history. It shows considerable signs of becoming a culturally and ethnically hybrid community from the 5th century as Lucanian power and influence spread southwards. And by the 3rd century, obviously, it had been conquered by Rome, and in 273 it became a Latin colony with quite far-reaching impact on the fabric of the city. However, one of the things that I've been tripping over quite a lot in my recent research and also editing a new book on the Western Greeks is that it's far from clear how best to approach the study of Paestum. On the one hand, we have ancient sources which unanimously depict the arrival of the Lucanians as a violent takeover by an alien non-Greek ethnic group and present it almost universally as a traumatic event which destroys Greek Paestum. We don't know as much about the Roman colony, but it's clear from the epigraphic and material remains that Greek culture actually survives substantially alongside that of the Lucanians in the 4th and 3rd centuries until we get the foundation of the Roman colony, at which point there's quite a drastic remodelling of the ancient city, all of which poses some profound questions about how best to interpret the history of Paestum in the 5th to the 3rd centuries. Is it possible to construct a model which integrates both ancient sources and material evidence, which is something I've been grappling with for other areas of Magna Graecia for many years? Can Paestum be regarded as a case study in ethnic interaction, hybridity or multiculturalism, or has, as has been recently suggested by several people, is ethnicity simply the wrong model to be looking at? Should we just throw that out and abandon it entirely as a conceptual model for studying the city? So I think there's quite a lot of areas which are problematic in particularly in that later phase of Paestum's history. We know from other multicultural communities in Magna Graecia, Naples and Velia, for example, that complex cultural and ethnic heritage is involved in a very complex set of cultural and collective memories which encode their relationship with their own past. And one of the things that I want to try and unpick is potentially how this might work at Paestum. Collective memories is something I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail later, but these are central to how a community defines itself and its relationship to its own past. But they're not static. They can be reinvented and reinvented again and interplay with different elements. There's also the very difficult question of how to integrate ancient sources which say one thing about the Lucanian takeover and 4th century, 3rd century Paestum, and the archaeological evidence which says something completely different. One of the methodologies that I've been trying to use in my own research is to treat ancient sources as largely an example of etic identity, i.e. an identity constructed by people from outside the community, either geographically or chronologically, which foreground specific attributes or aspects of the community that they want to foreground, as against material and epigraphic evidence, which is clearly much more of an emic identity generated from within the community. However, Paestum poses particular difficulties in this respect, because it's one of the few communities in Magna Graecia for which we do have direct contemporary 4th century written evidence of a very stark kind, which I'll come back to later on. it's probably pretty superfluous to revise to rehash the archaeological evidence, because we've already looked at it in quite a lot of detail. But for the sake of context, I'll summarise very briefly. The Greek polis was founded by Sybaris towards the end of the 7th or the beginning of the 6th century, as dated by some of the earliest grave goods and finds from the Northern Sanctuary, and has a more formal layout established around about 530 on Emanuele Greco's dating. It seems to have had quite a strong Achaean identity, using the Achaean script, with prominent cults of Hera, which are also found at other Achaean centres in Magna Graecia. But obviously that has a lot of resonance for what Tiziano was talking about with of why that should be. One of the peculiar things about that is that, as a recent study of the Paestum Hera sanctuaries by De Martino has argued, Hera cults are not actually that prominent in Achaea itself. He thinks that that's because Paestum and the Western Achaean identities are linked to a very early stage of Achaean development in which they may have had interests in the Eastern Argive plain. So he thinks that these will come from Argive Hera. So there seems to be a very strong encoding of an Achaean identity in the Greek city. But turning more to the Lucanian presence, one of the things which is very clear about this is that although it had some impact on the urban area of Paestum, the sanctuaries of Hera, as De Martino has argued, were modified to accommodate Lucanian ritual practices, particularly with the addition of stowers, dining areas and a water supply. And he suggests that they may have been some sort of conflation with some Lucanian cults, maybe Mephisis. There's still quite a high degree of continuity from the Greek period. And one of the really striking things is that the Forum and Agora area appears to be largely unaffected. There are Greek inscriptions from long after the Lucanian conquest. There's get an old style, give up on the mouse. There is this famous inscription from the Ecclesiasterion, which is in Achaean Greek script, but is an Oscan inscription, a dedication to Jove by somebody whose name is partly lost, but is clearly Oscan. So there's quite a lot of evidence that Greek and Oscan inscriptions and names, cultural practices do coexist. They may have had an impact on each other, but the point is that the Greek population and the Greek culture and the Greek language doesn't simply vanish. It's demonstrably there. And the fact that this again is written in Achaean script suggests that the cultural continuity with that aspect of the city remains important to the inhabitants. And just how significant that is perhaps revealed more if you flash forward to the period of the Roman Paestum, where you can see that the Roman Forum literally is driven right through the middle of the centre of the Greek city. The Ecclesiasterion is literally backfilled, and you can see from where the Roman Comitium building is, it literally turns its back on the Greek agora. So, the Roman colony is really making a point about a cultural break and a political break with the Greek past. Now, when we turn to the ancient sources, we hit some problems. If the material evidence shows continuity with quite a lot of Greek culture still embedded in the Lucanian city, when we turn to the ancient sources, we find that almost all of them depict the Oscan and Lucanian presence in Campania and Lucania, not just in Paestum, as a violent invasion. Livy talks about the seizure of the city, in this case Capua, taking place in an unusually horrible manner. The Samnites had been allowed by the Etruscans, the original population, to share in the amenities of the city because the Etruscans had been depleted by war. And then one night after a public holiday, when everyone's sleeping off the after effects, the Etruscans, the Samnites upped and slew everyone and took over the place. You know, dastardly Samnites. And we find the similar thing with Cumae, captured by the Campanians. Moving on to what happens, according to Strabo, in Paestum. The Lucanians take the city away from the Greeks, and then in turn the Romans take it away from the Lucanians. And elsewhere he says even more starkly that they mastered the Posidonians and their allies in war and took their cities away from them. So there's a fairly strong narrative here, and told in quite punchy terms, of a violent takeover and destruction, with an added spin, according to Livy, of it's a breach of hospitality, which is very bad and infringes all sorts of taboos. Now, this clearly can't be taken at face value. It's clearly a construction of identity by later writers, describing a situation which is not contemporary and from an external standpoint. Livy, in particular, is trying to set up the Samnites for his own purposes as devious and untrustworthy. And Strabo is talking about the Lucanians as being quite violent, and they come and take the city off the Greeks. And more programmatically, the very famous passage of Strabo in Book 6, where he's talking about barbarization of large chunks of Magna Graecia, although oddly enough he doesn't actually mention Paestum at all in this passage. He talks about them being thoroughly barbarized, ekba barbarosthai, and there's a real sort of yuck value in that term. It's very strong. It's, nasty. Yuck. So it's perhaps that may be giving us a hint on of what's going on here, because the theme of barbarization is one that runs throughout the ancient sources for the history of Magna Graecia and from the 4th century onwards. One of the things that I've spent quite a lot of time trying to do is pick out various themes which come through again and again and again in the various sources. Now, most of these are from Roman date, from the Augustan period onwards, and therefore, must surely represent later constructions of Italiote identity selected from ancient sources. But that process of selection invariably means that, that things are being selected that to fit a particular model that the authors want to construct. One of the things that many historians lean into is the idea that the Italiotes suffer from trouphe, decadence, and instability. But barbarization tends to come with part of that particular package, and a lot of this is often traced back to the work of Timaeus at Tauromenion. But the reason why Paestum is particularly interesting in this respect is that we're in an unusual position of having a near contemporary source from within Magna Graecia, if not from Paestum itself, which is the famous fragment of Aristoxenus of Tarentum, quoted by Athenaeus. I'm afraid I couldn't get all of this lot on one slide, not with the Greek as well as the translation. So this is Aristoxenus Part 1. Aristoxenus Part 2 is coming. And this poses some interesting questions, partly because of who Aristoxenus was. He's best known as a writer on music, but he was associated with the Tarentine statesman Archytas. He was part of the Neo-Pythagorean revival of the late 4th century, and he's thought to be a pupil of Aristotle. So that really plugs him into the most important political and intellectual movement of Hellenistic southern Italy. And also, interestingly, one which had quite a lot of traction in Lucania itself. There are quite a lot of evidence of Lucanian Pythagoreans. His dates aren't entirely clear. but he's unlikely to have survived as long as the Roman colony. And it's possible that this was all written around about the 320s. And this presents a very stark contrast to the material evidence for an integrated and multicultural city, because what he describes is extreme deculturation of the Greek population, saying that it's lost its languages and customs, its people have become barbarized, they become Etruscans or Romans, and their language has changed along with all their other practices. So again, we have this term ekbe barbarosthai. So it's a real sort of sense of being totally barbarized to the back teeth, and there's quite a lot of moral weighting to that in the way he tells it. He goes on in the second part of the passage to say that only one trace of the city's Greek history remains, which is this festival he describes, which he says the Paestums get together and imitate their ancient ways of speaking and behaving, their phoneo, their nomima, and onomata. And he says that after that they wail over this and weep and wail and generally sort of have a good sort of mourning session, and then they go back home. And it's an anecdote about what he sees as the decline of music, because he then goes on to say that we're in the same position because our theatres have been completely barbarised and musical performance has been debased. So that's the context in which he wants to talk about this. And clearly, given the variation between this and the material evidence, it needs some explanation. The most crashingly obvious observation, first of all, is that, again, this is a constructed identity composed by somebody from out with the city. Aristoxenus may have been a 4th century contemporary, but he was a Tarentine, and he may have had a political axe to grind, because Paestum was now very much detached from the Tarentine sphere of influence, despite various attempts to take it back by various condottieri employed by Tarentum. The only one who had any vestige of success seems to have been Alexander the Molossian in the late 330s. But we have to take into account also that there are two layers of selection here. We've got Aristoxenus' own views, which he has self-selected for a sympathetic miscellany of his own. And then we've got Athenaeus, who's also self-selecting for a sympathetic miscellany. So there are two levels of selection in all this, which means that it's very difficult to take it at face value. And I think there are three key questions here. Firstly, why did Aristoxenus, who must surely, as his contemporary, have known that there were still Greeks and Greek culture alive and well in Paestum, believe that Paestum was deculturated or want to present it like that? And why did he lay this at the door of the Romans and the Tyrrhenians, i.e. the Etruscans, rather than the Lucanians? And also, what was this single surviving Greek festival and its significance? Well, I want to take the festival first, because there have been various attempts to reconstruct this. The first observation is that he implies, the logic of his narrative implies that it's a regular event, so it's part of the ritual calendar of the city, which in itself suggests that Hellenism remains part of the cultural identity of Paestum. It rather undercuts Aristoxenus' own assertion, at least for some particular subgroups within society. The second thing I would say is that it's highly performative. It obviously has some sort of verbal element in which people have to recite the names of things, and possibly some sort of reenactment of unspecified Greek customs, plus this very theatrical and very extravagant display of mourning and lamentation. And I think that performative element may be possibly the reason why Aristoxenus has selected this as a parallel for his riff on the standards of musical performance. One particular version of this schematized, which I found quite useful, is by Antonio Lau, who basically argues that Aristoxenus is basically being just hyper-conservative. He wants to have a go at anything that he sees as debasing or changing various things that he cares about, principally musical performance, but obviously that's the that you know, he's using Paestum as the parallel. So one of the things that he seems to be saying is that this is a festival to reiterate parts of Greek culture and tradition which are no longer current in contemporary Paestum, which is clearly nonsense if you look at what's in the other forms available in other forms of evidence, like the inscriptions or the material culture. Now, various attempts have been made to reconstruct this ritual and identify what it might have been. Antonio Mariani did a close analysis of the text, concluding that the ritual in question is a hero cult, which he thinks might have been the cult of the oikist, maybe associated with the heroon in the agora. The problem with this, as very conclusively demonstrated by Flavia Frisone, is that oikist cults tend to emphasize celebration rather than mourning. She does a long comparison with Plutarch's Life of Aratus and the hero cult that is discussed in that. And also, the function of an oikist cult is to negotiate the collective identity of the community rather than mourn the founder or reify the past. So it doesn't quite fit with the sort of thing that Aristoxenus is describing. Instead, she suggests an association with a different form of hero cults. She notes that Croton celebrated a cult of Achilles, which is characterized by mourning rituals. It's something that's described in Lycophron's Alexandra. And Maurizio Giangiulio has taken that up and suggested that other Achaean colonies of Italy may have had similar cults. He cites evidence from Sybaris and also some of the metopes from Foce del Sele. However, I'm not entirely convinced that this solves the problem, because both Frisone and Giangiulio are arguing that these are rituals about rites of passage and establishing collective socio-political identity of the entire community. But what Aristoxenus is describing doesn't really seem to fit that pattern. Instead of continuity of previous rite, designed to integrate the community, this one actually appears to be a memory event, intended to reinforce part of an identity of part of that community. And that cultural memory is something I'll come back to. The second thing I want to talk about is barbarization. What Aristoxenus means by this and why he focuses on Romans and Tyrrhenians while ignoring the Lucanians. The idea of Greek language and identity being eroded and the idea of being barbarized isn't unique to Paestum. Glenn Bowersock has argued that the barbarized Greek is actually quite a well-defined concept by the late 4th century. And he notes that people like Isocrates talk about Greeks who've lost their culture. And I've also argued elsewhere that the topos of barbarization is a central element of later constructions of identity for the Western Greeks. So it's all part of a narrative in which similar allegations are levelled at the Greeks of the West in general. And even people like the Neapolitans, who generally get a much better press in the sources, because they've retained their Greek identity, there's still a certain amount of criticism because they've interacted with non-Greek populations. So there's little doubt that barbarization is a preoccupation of Greek intellectuals of this period. Isocrates in particular seems to have been deeply concerned with Panhellenism and defence of the Greek world against the barbarians. And it's something that the tyrants of Syracuse get a certain amount of kudos from, because they can present themselves as defenders of Hellenism against Carthage. But one striking thing that I noted is that if you look up the etymology of all this, barbaros is relatively widely used as a noun, but verbs denoting becoming or behaving like a barbarian, things like barbarizzo or like barbarosai, are relatively few in number and mostly late in date. There are some earlier occurrences, again in Isocrates, and also the letters attributed to Plato, and obviously Aristoxenus himself. But apart from that, it tends to be used only by a handful of sources of the late Hellenistic and Roman period, people like Strabo and Dionysius of Halicarnassus. Polybius does use the word, but he uses it in a purely descriptive sense rather than something with a moral weighting, whereas some of the other authors, particularly Strabo and Aristoxenus, tend to have a very pejorative spin on it. So that question automatically raises the question of why later authors are so keen to preserve material which play on unflattering stereotypes of barbarization and deculturation. There's quite a strong parallel here with another of the various stereotypes of the Western Greeks that I've looked at quite a lot, which is that of Trouphe, decadence. And there is a very heavy weighting of that appearing as a concept in the historians of the Augustan period onwards, suggesting that authors were actually, definitely homing in on that as a stereotype that they wanted to present, surround and associate with the Western Greeks. The other strange thing about the Aristoxenus passage is that the Romans and Etruscans are named as the agents of barbarization, despite the fact that he's writing well before the Roman conquest. So, the obvious explanation, which is that the Romans are the good guys because this was written in the Roman period, isn't really available to us. There have been various attempts to, particularly by Fraschetti, to suggest that this identification of Romans as barbarians reveals a very hostile anti-Roman tradition representing Romans as barbarians and therefore inimical to Greeks, which in turn is interesting because there's a parallel tradition at this point which depicts Rome as a polis Hellenis, a Greek city, and tries to argue that Rome is a Greek foundation and therefore sort of drag Rome into a sort of Greek framework intellectually. One of the reasons why I think there might be a political angle to this is that because Aristoxenus is politically aligned with the direction of Tarentine policy under Archytas, which is to maintain good relations with the Samnites but oppose Rome. Maybe there is a distinct political angle to this. On the other hand, this is a really complex topic because, as various other people, notably Vanotti, have pointed out, rival depictions of Rome as a polis Hellenis on the one side or a polis Tyrrhenis, an Etruscan city, on the other, are actually not necessarily that oppositional by the time you get to the 3rd century, because you're starting to get to the point where the two strands are converging as Rome expands in Italy. So, going back to the question of what this tells us, if anything, about the Paestums themselves and their understanding of their own identity, I think one helpful way into this might be to look at it from the standpoint of cultural memory, which is quite contested in terms of its definitions, but that's basically a broad checklist. One useful definition that I've found is that it's about the operation of the present and the past, and the past in the present. So it's an interplay between your own understanding of your past and how that's represented. In other words, the past is used to shape and validate contemporary cultures and social relations and power structures. It's invariably a collective memory rather than an individual one, but it doesn't have to be at state level. It can be a collective memory by different groups within the state. Such as families, particular ethnic groups, social classes, you can subdivide it in lots of different ways. And these can form different memory communities which may interpret monuments, symbols and rituals in ways which are at variance, with each other or with the official state narrative. So it's formed from an interaction between historical and commemorative symbols and individual beliefs, suggesting that there's a considerable amount of individual and group agency in how these memories develop. The other thing is that they are invariably selective. They require choices about what aspects of a community's past should be preserved and conversely what should be downgraded and suppressed. One of the big theorists on this is Connaughton, who's argued that cultural forgetting is as powerful as cultural memory, because all societies need to edit their cultural memories. One quite useful schema that I've found quite helpful is Assmann, who tries to form a schema for looking at the difference between what he terms communicative memory, which is more recent cultural memories, and deep cultural memories. How these are represented is something that's haggled over. So some scholars argue that essentially cultural memory is a spatial phenomenon which has to be mapped out onto the civic landscape, whereas others see it more as something which is transmitted through ritual and performance. And I think that this is something which has an obvious relevance to the ritual described by Aristoxenus. Aristoxenus implies that it's associated with a particular location, although he doesn't say where exactly, and there's no real way of drilling down into which area that this might be associated with. I mean, if we remove the idea that it might be associated with the Heroon, which I think we do have to, and it seems to have been a regular rent, so it fulfills the criterion of regular repetition to reinforce the memory, which is an essential part of the process. And all the various elements, the public recall and recitation of ancient names and customs, all suggest a memory event designed to perpetuate a specific vision of the city's past. Where I think it gets very difficult is when you would try to associate it with a pre-existing cult. I'm not at all clear that it was, or if it was, that it was associated with a cult which was taking on new aspects. I mean, we can trace through in other areas of Magna Graecia, notably in Naples, examples where particular cults aren't, change their significance in the late Hellenistic and Roman period to reflect different cultural identities, or some which aren't very prominent in the Greek period. Dionysus, for instance, suddenly become very, very prominent and become a signifier of Greek culture. So I think one of the things that might be going on here is that we're looking at a cult which is either being repurposed, or a set of mourning rituals which and commemorative rituals which are being invented as a symbol of reinforcing Greek identity. One of the other things that I think about this is that it may have been a memory event devoted to a specific social group, because Aristoxenus claims that it isn't. He doesn't say that it's all the Paestums that do this. He implies that it's a subset of the community. I mean, he just kind of sort of vaguely references them as Greeks, but then, if it's a mixed community, then how would you define that? So one of the things that I've been wondering is that whether this is an identity and a series of memory practices associated with a particular subset of the Paestum elite or specific families. And the parallel here that I've got partly in my mind is Naples, where certain types of Greek funerary iconography and also mixed Greek and Oscan names are associated with particular clusters of burials and particular hypogea, and don't seem to get beyond those, suggesting that these are identities of specific families. So to return to my starting point about ethnicity at Paestum, and whether it's a useful analytical framework or whether we should just throw it out, it clearly was a multicultural community in which ethnicity is not, I think, a determining factor of identity at the civic level. I mean, if you went up to an ancient Paestum and said, "How would you define your identity, sir?" they'd probably say, "Well, I'm Paestum." Idiot, what is this woman on about? But I'm also persuaded that below the level of the civic collective, city identity, its unique circumstances may have given rise to memory communities within the city that saw their Greek past as part of an important part of their heritage, and really went out of their way to perpetuate that. How that maps onto specific social groups is unclear. I mean, I just floated an idea that it might be, specific families within the elite that wanted to do this. And I also think that maybe this is an identity which is expressed either in new rituals or a reinvention of an existing one. So I don't think Aristoxenus' emphasis on conservatism and nostalgia doesn't preclude any change to traditional rituals. I mean, this seems to have happened in Naples and possibly also in Velia. So I think what it does imply is that there are some sections of the community in full century Paestum who were regularly and actively engaging with the city's Greek past in ways that suggest that ethnic identity, although maybe not the primary identity at civic level, is still significant for them. Thank you.